start pretty soon. So for today, we're going to be looking at the Yud Gimel Middos of Rabbi Yishmael. We're not going to finish him today. It'll be at least a few days. And remember how the Rambam understands the idea of drasha, that the Rambam was machalek, you'll remember, between different parts of the Torah Shebal Peh. There is part of the Torah Shebal Peh that is called Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, in which Hashem directly gave a specific halacha to Moshe Rabbeinu to pass down. And these would be things like tefillin are black, tefillin are square. There is nothing in the Chumash that says that, but this is what is called Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. And then the Rambam divides Halacha L'Moshe Misinai into two different groupings. There is Halacha L'Moshe Misinai that has no connection to a pasuk at all, like tefillin is black. There's nothing in the Torah that would suggest that. So we'll call that a Halacha L'Moshe Misinai type 1. And then there is Halacha L'Moshe Misinai type 2, which is still a Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, but there is a remez, an allusion to it in the written Torah. And an example of that would be, how do you know an esrog, right? How do you know? The Torah says on Sukkot, you have to take a pre-Eitz Hadar, the fruit of a beautiful tree, and that could be anything, right? That could be a papaya. So the Gemara says, we know that it's esrog because the word hadar, which means beautiful, can also be read hadar, that which remains on a tree. An esrog never falls off. An esrog can keep on growing till it'll be the size of a watermelon. Now the Rambam explains, it's not the pshat that the Chachamim look at the word hadar and they make a drasha that it's esrog. They knew it was esrog even before the drasha. It was halacha l'Moshe Misinai, but the Torah then gives you a hint. This is the type of hint that it's an after-the-fact hint, meaning once you know the halacha, you go back. In other words, it's not a derivative thing. It's not that we look at this word and, oh, now I know. Rather, when you know the halacha, you go back and you find how the Torah alludes. It's interesting. It seems to me that if the Rambam says some halacha l'Moshe Misinais have no connection to the pasuk, and some halacha l'Moshe Misinais have a connection to the pasuk, that seems to be seiser a klal of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon actually said there is no such thing as anything that is not merumas in the Torah Shebichsav. I mean, if the Rambam seems to say some halacha l'Moshe Misinais have no connection to the lashon of the pasuk, that would be, I think, keneged the Graz Yisai, that every single thing can be found in Torah Shebichsav. Be it as it may, whether it's a Halacha L'Moshe Misinai type 1 or Halacha L'Moshe Misinai type 2, you're dealing with Hashem giving Moshe a specific rule. Hashem said this is the rule, and it gets passed down from generation to generation as part of the Torah Shebal Peh, until it was eventually written down in the Mishnah and the Gemara for the various reasons that there was a danger of it being forgotten. And we have the heter based on the pasuk in Tehillim, Eis Lasais Lashem, when it's a time to stand up for Hashem, Meferah Torasecha, we are given permission to violate the Torah. Again, this is not a private rule that we can apply to ourselves, but the Chachamim of the generation can sometimes technically violate the Torah if there is a need for the long-term survival of Judaism, and therefore, even though the oral law was not supposed to be written down, but they said if chas v'shalom we would lose it, Judaism would be destroyed, Am Yisrael would be destroyed. So they did what's called Eis Lasais Lashem. I do want to remind you of the Rambam's very interesting chiddush, and I'm not sure if there's an absolutely clear makor for this, that even when the Torah Shebal Peh could not be written down, that did not stop private people from making notes. You always were allowed to make notes, but there was no book, so to speak, in which people would communally learn from. And indeed, as I tried to explain, when we went over how the Mishnah and the Gemara was written, a lot of the material may have been notebooks, right? Imagine Ravina and Ravashi having piles of notebooks of hundreds and hundreds of years from many, many people. That may have been part of the raw material out of which the Mishnah and the Gemara was compiled. That's a very interesting chiddush, and in fact, it's mashma from the Rambam. The Rambam seems to say it, that even Moshe, even in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, people could make notes of Moshe Rabbeinu's teachings. It's almost like, we wouldn't call it this way, it's almost like a first edition of the Torah, because the Torah itself was not finished till the last day of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, but in the meantime, people were writing what you might call the unauthorized versions of the Torah, meaning not Hashem's words, but your own words. When you hear Moshe Rabbeinu, you wrote it up in your own words, and you had your notebook. Lahavdil compared only to Hashem. This is what they do with the Brisker Torah, right? Rav Chaim, the Brisker Rav, a lot of things they didn't write, but all of the stuff we have, Rav Chaim al Rambam is from Rav Chaim, but a lot of the Chidushei Hagrach, al Shas, it's not Rav Chaim's words. These are Talmidim writing up all of these different versions of how they understood Rav Chaim and the Brisker Rav, etc. So you have all of these. Some of them are authorized versions, some of them are unauthorized versions. So you actually had unauthorized versions of the Torah circulating around before Hashem dictated the language of the Torah itself. Okay, but again, this is halacha l'Moshe misinai. Halacha l'Moshe means Hashem gave a specific rule. We then come to a third category, which is called drasha. Now, superficially, I know this is a bit of a review, superficially, drasha does resemble halacha l'Moshe misinai type 2, because you're looking at a pasuk, the Chazal, and they're darshaning meaning they're interpreting a verse, and they are extracting halachos. Just like Esrog, pre-Eitz Hadar be'ilanim mishana l'shana. So what is the difference between halacha l'Moshe misinai type 2, which has a remez in the Torah, and the idea of drasha, which is using the lashon of the Torah? The answer is, according to the Rambam at least, not everybody would agree, that in the case of a drasha, there was no actual halacha that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to Moshe. Rather, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us rules by which the Chachamim can use to interpret the Torah, and the Chachamim are permitted to utilize those rules to create, to infer new halachos that may not have been known until the drasha was made. You see, halacha l'Moshe misinai, by definition, was always known. Maybe the remez in the pasuk was not known. Meaning, we knew that pre-Eitz Hadar was Esrog even before we knew the remez in the Torah. The remez may have come later. Somebody looks closely and they come up with the remez. The halacha was known. With a drasha, it's exactly the opposite. Until the drasha is made, the halacha did not exist. The halacha comes from the drasha. Now that's kind of a mind-blowing proposition if you think about it, because that means when the Chachamim make drashos for certain halachos, then until the drasha was made, the halacha was not that way. But the Chachamim, when I say the Chachamim, I mean the Sanhedrin, basically. In fact, even Tanoim and Amoraim, who are not in the Sanhedrin, cannot create halachas through drashas. But the Sanhedrin is given that koach. They are given the koach to interpret the Torah to be mitzi halachas. So this is a very important point, that when we say the oral law was given to Moshe and Har Sinai, that doesn't mean every single halacha of the oral law was given to Moshe Sinai. There is halacha Moshe Sinai, then there are the klalim of drasha, and then the chachamim in each generation, the Sanhedrin, can interpret the Torah to be motzi different drashas. Okay, so a drasha is a chiddush of a halacha. Yeah. No, every halacha Moshe Sinai was given directly, but drasha is not halacha Moshe Sinai. Anything that's halacha l'Moshe Sinai was given by Hashem to Moshe. That's what the word means. But the Rambam writes, most of the Torah Shebaal Peh is not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The Rambam, in fact, enumerates around less than 50. All right, people say his list is not complete, but be it as it may, if you consider the number of halachos in Shas, and you have thousands of halachos, most of them are not halacha l'Moshe. And by the way, I'm not even dealing with rabbinic laws, takanos and gezeros. Those are rabbinic laws. I'm talking about d'oraisa laws. When we make a drasha, that is a d'oraisa law. But a d'oraisa law does not necessarily mean Hashem gave the specific law to Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, be sure you understand this. There are d'Rabbanan laws that bichlal are not even derived from the Torah. Ner Chanukah, Ner Shabbos. Those are d'Rabbanans. Drashos are d'oraisas. But they're d'oraisas based on the Chachamim interpreting. In fact, many say that the Rambam uses a unique term for this. Sometimes the Rambam talks about d'Rabbanan, and sometimes the Rambam talks about divrei sofrim, which also means the words of the rabbis. The sofrim are the... But the Kesef Mishnah says that there's a very important difference between divrei sofrim and d'Rabbanan. D'Rabbanan means the Rabbanan made a gezerah or a takana. Divrei sofrim is when the Rabbanan make a drasha, but that has the status of a doraisa. Okay, that's an important differentiation. Divrei sofrim just means it's not in the Torah. It's not in the Torah, but it's still doraisa because it comes from the drashas. So what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about the world of drasha, and there are a number of klalim in making drashos. Again, drashos are not something we can make today. In fact, even the Amoraim could not make drashos. You need a Sanhedrin. That's one of the jurisdictions they have is to look at the Torah Shebechsav and make drashos. And the most famous list is Rabbi Yishmael's list of 13 Middos, 13 attributes, Shatayra Nidreshes Bahem. Now we're going to see, I'm not going to talk about today, that the truth is Rabbi Yishmael's list is a very problematical list because it's very, very clear that there are more than the 13 Middos that he mentions. In fact, there are some very common Middos that the Gemara uses all the time that are not on Rabbi Yishmael's list. I mean, let me give you a simple example. Hekesh. Hekesh is a drasha based on juxtaposition. Two things are next to each other, so you can learn and compare one thing to another thing. That's a very common drasha. Well, where is it on Rabbi Yishmael's list? Isn't there. Another example is riboy. No, the Torah has an extra word, so the extra word is coming to teach you something. A very common drasha, although very problematical, because how do you know what it's coming to teach you? It's a very problematical drasha, but it's a very common drasha, called riboy. Where is it on Rabbi Yishmael's list? Not there. Miut, when the Torah says rak, only, that's coming to exclude something. Very common drasha. Where is it on Rabbi Yishmael's list? Not there. So one very important thing to recognize is that Me'ezatam Shiyiyah, when Rabbi Yishmael enumerates 13 interpretive keys to making drashas, Rabbi Yishmael's list is absolutely not a complete list. And there are a number of other klalim that Chazal were makabel that can be used for drasha. So we're going to have to somehow explain, although there's not really a great answer, why Rabbi Yishmael's list only mentions some and not others. Now, we're going to see that there is actually another list which talks about 32 interpretive keys to interpret the Torah, and that does include all of these things. But the 32 is said to be for Agadata. So The official statement is 13 principles for the interpretation of halacha and 32 principles for the interpretation of agada. But the truth of the matter is, the agada ones also are used in halacha. So even that is a little odd. Why are you calling them only principles for agada? Okay, so that's one thing to think about. Now, in the opposite direction, we are told that before Rabbi Yishmael, there was the great Hillel, right? Hillel HaNasi, Hillel HaZaken. And Hillel HaZaken enumerated 7 principles. So we go from 7 principles of Hillel to 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael to 32 principles of Agada of Rabbi Elazar ben Rav Yossi. Okay, so the lists here are kind of elusive exactly, but we'll look at Rabbi Yishmael because, number one, at least the words are relatively familiar, and as you know, either you say it or you don't say it, but it's in the Cedar, right before Pesukei de Zimra, before Mizmor Shir. We have a part, in fact, that whole part of davening is a little, you have to understand it. We say korbanos, because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, so we say Parshas HaTamid, other korbanos, and then we learn the perek, the 5th perek of Zvachim, Ezeyu Mekayman Shel Zvachim. And why do we learn that? It's all perek of Mishnah. Why do we learn that perek of Mishnah? So there are 2 reasons why we say that perek. Number one, that's a perek about all the different korbanos, so we want to have the merit of korbanos. Number 2, interestingly enough, it is the only perek in Shas in which there is no machlokas in the Mishnayos at all. So you want to learn a part of Torah which is 100% true because there are no different opinions. So people don't understand that the purpose of saying Ezeyu Mekayman is to learn a perek of Mishnah. It's not like a prayer. It's to learn Mishnayos of the Korbanos. And by the way, if you learn that perek, you will know quite a lot about Korbanos. You really can learn quite a lot from just learning that perek of Mishnayos. And then, because Mishnah is Torah Sheba'al Peh, we end that whole section with the principles of drasha that Rabbi Yishmael articulated. Where can you find these principles in their original source? They are the Hakdama to the Sifra. The Sifra is the halachic medrash on Sefer Vayikra. So if you pull out your Sifra from the shelf and turn to the first page, you will see Rabbi Yishmael enumerating 13 principles. And it's a much longer than it is in the Cedar, because for each principle he gives examples of the principle, which you don't really have in the Cedar itself. Okay, so we'll begin looking at a few of them. Some of them are more familiar, and some of them are less familiar. The first one is Kal V'chomer, and Kal V'chomer is sometimes translated by the Latin phrase a fortiori reasoning. And if you want to know what a fortiori reasoning is, I'll say, Kal V'chomer. Right? You know what it is. It's Kal V'chomer. And Kal V'chomer is essentially a logical principle. That is, you have 2 cases. The Torah gives you the din in case A, and you want to figure out, does this din apply to case B? Because the Torah only says case A, the Torah doesn't say case B. So we identify one case as chamor, stricter, and one case as more lenient by looking at the 2 things. And then we say, if a strict case has a leniency, then Kal V'chomer, how much more so a lenient case will have the leniency. Or it works the other way. If a lenient case is strict, then how much more so case B, which will be stricter, should also be strict. So a Kal V'chomer is going from known to unknown. The Torah, you have a known case, and then you have an unknown case, and you want to know if the law of the known will apply to the unknown. So if the law of the known is a leniency, then you will apply kal v'chomer to a case that's more lenient. And if the known is a strict case, then you will apply the strictness to a case that is more strict. So the logic of kal v'chomer requires that you be able to characterize the known as either a chomer or a kal, and the unknown as a chomer or a kal. Now, that will show you how a kal v'chomer gets refuted. Because you could identify a case as chomer because of one reason, and kal or whatever, but I could point out another way in which what you think is chomer may actually be kal. What you think is kal may actually be chomer, because things are often mixtures, right? Something, in other words, the unknown might be stricter in one way than the known, or it might be more lenient in other ways. So, since you never have a pure thing, which is always 100% more chomer than something else, things are composites. So a very common refutation of a kal v'chomer is to basically say that what you think is kal might be, we don't know, might be chomer. What you think is chomer might be kal. That's one type of refutation. And the Gemara then will go through different arguments. We'll get more specific as we go on. But there's another way a kal v'chomer is refuted. In other words, the first way a kal v'chomer is refuted is by demonstrating what you thought is chomer is kal, what you thought is kal is chomer, therefore there's no kal v'chomer. The other way is not refuting the chomer and the kal, but simply showing you that your kal v'chomer by definition can't work, because I will come up with the third case. In other words, like we have case A, and I want to make a kal v'chomer from case A to case B. Now, one other way of refuting a kal v'chomer is I come up with a case C that is also known, and case C is also as chomer as B, and yet it doesn't have the chomer of A. So that doesn't explain why it doesn't, but it doesn't. So if it doesn't, your kal v'chomer can't be correct, because if it would be correct, it would be applied to C. Do you see the difference in the two refutations? Meaning, the first refutation is undermining the premises of what is kal and what is chomer. Meaning, what you think is kal, The second type of refutation is not undermining the premises, but it's undermining the conclusion from the premises. That your kal v'chomer can't be right, because the kal v'chomer you're trying to make to be, the unknown, would have applied equally to C, and yet the Torah says by C we don't give it the law of A, even though C would have the same kal v'chomer. So, whatever your logic is, whether you're logically right or wrong, I don't know, but the Torah doesn't accept your reasoning. Okay, so keep in mind, therefore, that kal v'chomers are refuted, and again, and of course, refutations have cross-refutations. I mean, this is a long discussion that can go on for several dafim. Sometimes very, very confusing. And I'll get to it. In fact, I may, I don't want to give you a whole Gemara here, but I actually may show you around an Amud or an Amud and a half of Gemara in Bava Metzia to kind of take you through this, so you'll see a picture. Maybe you've learned that Gemara as to how we deal with kal v'chomers. Again, I've mentioned before the Chiddush of the Netziv. It's a very disheartening Chiddush, I think. The Netziv says that the Iker learning of Torah Shebal Peh is to understand the methodology of drashos. The pilpul in svara that we generally do in learning, the Netziv says is a secondary level of Torah Shebal Peh. So it's very interesting that precisely what we spend very little time on, the drashos, the Netziv says is the Iker Torah Shebal Peh. What we spend all our time on, which are the svaras and the reasonings and the arguments, that's called Havayas Abaya V'Rava, the questions and answers of Abai of a Rava, and that's very important for halakha. For halachic purposes, that absolutely is essential. But in terms of the Havana of Torah Shebaal Peh, the Nitziv says it is secondary. So everyone understands the two different ways that we address, we attack, we undermine Kal V'chomers, and then the Gemara goes into Shakla V'tarya. I'm sorry, in the back, did you want to say something? You had your hand up. Yeah. No, yeah. Oh, okay. So there's a lot of synonyms that are used here, and I'll point it out for other Middos as well. Kol Shekain and Kal V'chomer are the same, are exactly the same. The name of the Midah is Kal V'chomer, but Chazal sometimes use the word Kol Shekain. So they are, as far as I know, they are interchangeable words. Okay? Yeah.
Going back to what Phil was saying, so like practically, what would that, what Sfarim, I guess, would that translate to?
So there are Sfarim from the Rishonim that go into the Yud Gimel Midas in great depth, a tremendous amount of detail that can be very, very difficult Sfarim. First, all of the Meforshim on the Taras Kayanim go into it. That's one thing. Then you have a Sefer from one of the Balei HaTaisvos called Sefer Krisus. A strange name, but Sefer Krisus goes on it. The Sefer Halichas Olam is probably the most definitive work on the Yud Gimel Midas, and the like. And if you look at the end of Maseches Brachos, there's a whole section on introduction to the Gemara. You'll see a lot of Meforshim on the Yud Gimel Midas and on the 32 Midas of Agadata as well. Now, for Kal V'chomers, we have a few interesting rules. There are rules in Kal V'chomers. First of all, the Torah itself employs Kal V'chomer reasoning. If you remember, and this is what Torah's Kohanim says, when Miriam becomes a Mitzaras, remember Miriam spoke Lashon Hara about Moshe, so she was stricken with leprosy. Saras. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, a Kal V'chomer, he says, if her father would have spit in her face, she would have been so humiliated. She would go into seclusion for 7 days. So she should certainly go into seclusion for 7 days when God has given her saras. Now, I don't know if you would have identified that, but that's a Kal V'chomer. Meaning, Hashem is much more significant than a flesh and blood parent. So if she would be ashamed of what a flesh and blood person did to her, Kal V'chomer, she should be ashamed, right? Because the flesh and blood parent is the Kal. Hashem is the Chomor. So if for a Kal, I'm so ashamed, I go into hiding for 7 days, Kal V'chomer, for Hashem, I should go into hiding for 7 days. Kal V'chomer. Now, question is, well, wait a second here. Hashem is so much more chomer. What do you mean 7 days? If for a human she would do it for 7 days, then for Hashem she should do it 14 days, 21 days, 35 days. So there's an important rule about a Kal V'chomer, that a Kal V'chomer cannot go beyond. In other words, when you're extrapolating from case A, and you're saying case A is a Kal, and if case A is a Kal, and it has a strictness, then case B, which is Chomor, should also have that strictness. You can't go beyond the strictness that case A had. You can't say, so to speak, that if case A is strict, then Kal V'chomer, case B, should be double. Okay, and this is a very important rule in a Kal V'chomer, and this goes by we normally refer to it by one word, but that one word is part of a sentence. This is the Dayo rule. Dayo means it's enough. Like Dayenu, Dayo. And the whole sentence reads, Dayo lavo min hadin lios kanidain. It is sufficient, it is enough for that which is extracted from a Kal V'chomer. Interesting, the word din, which we translate as law, actually means things you learn from a Kal V'chomer. It is sufficient for that which comes from a Kal V'chomer to be the same as that which it comes from, and not more. And the raya is that Hashem didn't say Miriam should be in seclusion more than she would be had her father spit in her face, but only the same. So that's the proof of the Dayo principle. And throughout Shas, you're going to see that whenever a Kal V'chomer is used, occasionally Chazal try this, to make something stricter than the original source, Chazal will ask the Kasha, can't do that because of the Dayo principle. The logic of Dayo is really a fairly simple logic, because the logic is, if you can use a Kal V'chomer to go beyond, then how much is beyond? I mean, if you're going to say, oh, if she would have been ashamed for 7 days, then for Hashem it must be much more. Well, how much more? Double, triple, quadruple, right? There's no limit. So the only sensible limit you can have is to make it the same. Okay, that's principle number 1 of Kal V'chomer. Again, there are a lot of principles, so I'm just going to be very selective. Yeah.
When you say we can't go beyond the strictness of the case A,
yeah,
because Kal V'chomer can go both ways, are we talking about the Kal every time then, or?
Well, I gave you an example, but it can work. It can work the other way too. So, for example, if case A is Mako, and you want to use the Kal V'chomer that case B should also be lenient, because it's lenient in other ways, you can't make it more lenient.
Oh, okay.
In other words, it'll work both ways. In other words, it basically means that you are locked in to the parameters of either the Kal or the Chomor of case A. Okay, this is called the Dayo principle. So most of the time we don't say the whole sentence, we say Dayo, but technically Dayo lavo min hadin. It is sufficient for that which comes from a Kal V'chomer, lios, to be exactly kanidon or nadon, different people vocalize it differently, to be like the case from which you are extracting it. Okay, a second principle of a Kal V'chomer is that Kal V'chomers have limitations. Chazal demarcated that certain things cannot be used from or derived from a Kal V'chomer. And among them is a principle that's a little problematical. This is in Maseches Makos, and this is called Ein Onshin Min Adin. We cannot impose punishments via a Kal V'chomer. A Kal V'chomer can tell me what is mutter or what is usher. A Kal V'chomer can create prohibitions and restrictions. But a Kal V'chomer cannot be used to impose a punishment. So, for example, if case A has a certain designation, I'll give you a tangible example, but let's look at it in the abstract. If case A has a punishment, and it's a lenient type of case, and case B is a stricter case, and I want to make a Kal V'chomer, if case A, which is lenient, has a punishment, then Kal V'chomer, case B, should have the same punishment? Can't do it, because this is called Ein Onshin Min Adin. Now, let me give you the proof. The Gemara in Makos says that you cannot use a Kal V'chomer as a basis for creating punishment. The Torah says in Parshas Acharei Mos that you are not allowed to have relations with the sister that is either the daughter of your father or the daughter of your mother. So the Torah prohibits, we're talking about the punishment. The Torah gives a punishment. The Torah gives kares. The Torah says there's death in the hands of heaven if a person has relations with his half-sister. So the Brisa then says, I only know your chayav kares for the daughter of your mother who's not the same father as you, or vice versa. How do I know your chayav kares for a sister with whom you share both of your parents? And we have to have an extra pasuk to include the whole sister. So the question is, why do I need a pasuk that says you're chayiv kares for a whole sister? It's a kal v'chomer. If case A is a half sister, which is logically more lenient than a whole sister. If case A you're chayiv kares, then kal v'chomer, case B, you're chayiv kares. Right? Answer, I couldn't use the kal v'chomer to create the chayiv kares. Ein onshin min hadin. Again, min hadin is used for a kal v'chomer. You cannot impose punishment via a kal v'chomer. And that is why, if the Torah had not told me I'm chayiv kares for a whole sister, I would not have been chayiv kares for a whole sister. The kal v'chomer cannot take me that far. Another example is the well-known halacha of Edom Zomimim. Right, I'm sure you've learned this. Right, what are Edom Zomimim? Two witnesses testify, Ruvain killed Shimon. We saw Ruvain kill Shimon in New York on Sunday. Two other witnesses come and they say, we don't know if Ruvain killed Shimon. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But you did not see Ruvain kill Shimon on New York on Sunday because on Sunday that day you were with us in Chicago. So what does the Torah say? The Torah says that we do to the first witnesses what they tried to do to Ruvain. They tried to get Ruvain killed. So what do? We kill them. This is Vasisam Lo, you do to the witnesses, Kasher Zamam, as they attempted to do to Ruvain. Now, there's a well-known halacha. What if the second witnesses didn't show up till after Ruvain was executed? Right? Ruvain got killed. And then the second pair shows up and says, sorry, we're late, COVID delays at the airport, but we have to say that, the Edom were with us. So you would think that's worse, right? So it says, no. Since the Torah says you punish the witnesses for what they tried to do, you don't punish them for what they did. That's a drasha. So the Gemara in Makos asks, wait a second. Why shouldn't Kal V'chomer carry the day here? Why don't we say, if the Torah says you're even Chayav Misa for what you tried to do when you were unsuccessful? That's the case A, right? Case A is explicit. Case B is where you don't know, right? Where the guy did it. But Kal V'chomer, case B is more chomer than case A. So why don't you kill the witnesses when they actually got the guy killed? The Gemara in Makos answers, you can't use a Kal V'chomer for onshim, ein onshim min hadin. Right? So these are two examples. One is the whole sister, and the other is the din of Edom Zomimim, where there is a limit on the Kal V'chomer. So basically, for our purposes today at least, we talked about the two ways a Kal V'chomer is refuted. And then we talked about two limitations on Kal V'chomer. One is the Dayo principle, and the other is the principle of Ein Onshin Min Hadin. You cannot impose punishment via a Kal V'chomer. Yeah.
Why does the Torah teach us two different places that Ein Onshin Min Hadin? Wouldn't we say that if there's two places, then it's the only reason to teach it?
Well, okay. So in reality, maybe I wasn't clear. The Torah didn't teach you it in two places. Meaning, by Edom Zomimim, you wouldn't know. Meaning, you only know from the sister the rule of Ein Onshin Min Hadin, and then you apply it to Edom Zomimim. Edom Zomimim does not teach you the principle. I just use Edom Zomimim to illustrate the principle, but that's not the source of it. The source of the principle is the case of the sister. Yeah.
The question is definition when it says that someone who shares a mother with you is forbidden, someone who shares a father with you is forbidden.
wouldn't both of those categories also include regular sisters?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's a very, very good question. Meaning one could question the Gemara's premise that I even need a kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer is when the Torah talks about case A and case B is not directly covered, but I want to bridge it by logical inference. Your argument is that a whole sister includes the daughter of father and mother. So I don't need a kal v'chomer. The whole sister can be directly included. Very, very excellent question. But the short answer would be, the simple answer would be, that since the Torah says the daughter of your father or the daughter of your mother, that actually implies that the Torah is saying a sister who is not dual parentage, and you only know dual parentage via the kal v'chomer, meaning you would not include it in the actual words. But it is a very good point. There are meforshim that talk about it in that way. Okay, so that's kind of the midah of kal v'chomer, and we'll see you tomorrow.